This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on G20 Finance Track priorities under India's presidency at G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting. The participants are Siddharth, Economic Analyst, and Gora Dhawan Lal, AIR Correspondent.
Siddharth, welcome to the program. A pleasure to have you on the show with us.
Thank you for having me here.
So actually the focus today, and as we're looking at, India has the G20 presidency right now, and finance is the linchpin of every economy. And today with the means, methodologies, requirements of the sector, how countries are connected, how countries have common issues, I think all that context is also changing. And of course, in December, we did have a meeting of the finance ministry officials as a precursor. We did have meeting of the deputies of the G20 Finance and Central Bank. Now there's a meeting of the first G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors under the Indian presidency of the G20. In your thought and ideology, I think somewhere when we look at all the factors of how, well, the stock markets are an indication, but the Russia-Ukraine war, COVID pandemic and the post-COVID effect, India has survived well. India has kept its act together. What do you think are certain critical areas that would be a priority for this meeting?
Well, I think this meeting is very significant because this is the first time that the finance ministers and the central bank governors are meeting. There would be 4 meetings during India's presidency, and this is the first among the 4 meetings, and this is the first ministerial that is happening, which will be followed by the foreign ministers meeting early next month. So this kind of sets the tone for India's presidency at the ministerial level. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi's message at the first meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors was clearly to focus on the most vulnerable sections of society who have been hit by COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the recent spike in inflation in several parts of the world. The other message was also focused on the more vulnerable countries who are reeling under the impact of high debt. Some of it has again got to do with COVID. So countries in our neighborhood have also been impacted by high debt levels, and there is an attempt to get countries together to address this debt problem, which was the other focus that the Prime Minister had in his inaugural statement. Further, he talked about reforming the multilateral development bank. Basically, the idea that India has been pursuing is that these multilateral development banks need to vitalize, rework to deal with present-day challenges such as climate change and also address the high debt levels in several countries. Apart from that, a key theme of the Prime Minister's message was on how India has used digital technology to deliver public goods. And he talked about how money could be transferred seamlessly and in a touchless manner during the COVID pandemic and cited the example of UPI. He pointed to India's experience and urged the finance ministers and central bank governors to experience for themselves how power of technology could be used for good. He said that this model could be used by other countries and India is willing to share its expertise on it. In fact, at the event, this whole thing is being displayed as well. At the same time, the PM has also sounded note of caution on some of the recent innovations, as he said, in digital finance, which pose the risk of destabilization and misuse. His reference was to evolution of cryptocurrencies, which countries around the world are seeking to regulate. And India has said that how they are trying to use G20 as a forum to get everyone on board to regulate crypto assets.
So when we look at what's happening around, I think in terms of inflation, the conversation has been, and it started some time back, the increase, and countries, as you rightly said, are still battling it. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has entered its second year. I think the word chronic somewhere does crop up in our minds. And is there a fear of inflation becoming chronic? And this war, it's been 2 years. Do you think countries have adapted and the fallout that will come after that? Because, it's going to take some time for the effect to actually settle in. Will that be long lasting?
Well, the problem with high levels of inflation is that it seeps into your economy. Your cost of living goes up. Wage inflation happens. And then you get into this virtuous cycle, wages going up and that again feeding into inflation, and services inflation comes in, and all those sort of things happen. What it also means is that to deal with high inflation, central banks increase interest rates. And as interest rates go up, especially in United States, the other central banks are forced to increase interest rates to also check a flight of capital from their country, because overseas money which is in their markets would tend to go back to the US, which offers higher interest rates. So there is an impact on their economies in terms of the flight of capital. The other problem of high interest rates is on the debt levels of the poor and the developing countries, which, servicing debt is becoming a problem. And that is another aspect that is going to be discussed at this meeting, and how to tackle this debt problem. We are seeing around India that how certain countries in our neighborhood have been hit hard by high levels of debt, and their economies are in shambles.
Right. Do you think there's going to be a change in the role of the World Bank and the IMF now in this time?
Absolutely. That is something that several countries led by India are asking, that, you need to redefine the role of multilateral banks such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund in the wake of the change in the global order, and reposition themselves as 21st century development banks which reflect the modern day realities, including the voting rights or the way they are run, reflect the new global economic power, where developing countries such as India, China, Brazil have far more weight than 50, 60 years ago.
Very rightly said. And this needs to be done on priority, because institutional change, moving, they're like huge behemoths that needed to be changed and moved, takes a lot of time. We don't have that luxury, do we?
No, that is something that takes a lot of time. Unfortunately, these are issues which are done only through global consensus, and that consensus is going to take time, especially when some countries have to give up powers in favor of the emerging economies and the developing economies.
Right. Coming back to, I think, somewhere which India has done very well is, making financial solutions affordable and scalable. Is there something that we can really give out to the world at this summit, and what we've done well, and, do some peer sharing?
Well, if you look at India's presidency, one of the key themes that India is driving is this whole, thing around digital public infrastructure for advancing financial inclusion across the world. So solutions that India has, how they can be used to not just reach out to the poor, but also bring about some productivity gains. And this faith in the digital public infrastructure comes from the way it has been deployed in India. The way the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile networks have been used to deliver banking services, deliver social security, as well as delivering benefits such as the direct benefit transfer or even immunization during COVID times. So that is the infrastructure, which is an open source infrastructure, which is not tied to any company or any particular model. What we are offering to the world is this model that can be, tweaked, worked, and, built upon to suit various countries.
What are your views on the issue of climate finance? That's been in the news quite a lot.
The idea is to ensure that the developing countries have access to capital so that they are able to mitigate the climate threat and take on responsibilities that the West wants them to take. One of the issues that has been repeatedly been flagged, and again India has been at the core of this, providing the necessary capital for developing in the poor countries to scale up their models, to make the transition, which comes with an economic cost. And in fact, one of the things that will be deliberated is how do you deal with the economic costs of climate change? And going beyond that, how do you ensure that the public sector gets in first, the multilateral agencies get into the whole scheme of things, and then the private sector rides on that, because someone has to make that initial investment, and that can only come from the public sector and the multilateral institutions. In that context as well, the role of multilateral institutions is under review, how they can support this whole climate finance initiative so that the developing countries are not burdened with something without having the adequate resources to meet those goals.
Today we are looking at a scenario, Siddharth, where the developed countries, they're struggling with their economies. Do you think this would be a priority for them? Do you think that financing climate change effects and helping developing countries scale up is going to be a priority for them?
Well, I think it's an issue which is not just confined to developed or developing countries. It's a challenge that everyone has to take on. And what you see in the economic front is that every economy goes through these cyclical ups and downs. And irrespective of that, you're dealing with the problem of climate change, which is a long-term problem, which is not an overnight issue for which you need to not just plan, but create the necessary framework and make available finances over the long term. So it can't be brushed under the carpet. Otherwise, the entire world is going to suffer.
Absolutely. And, the butterfly effect or all of us being linked at the hip. And I think that's a very important point. We've always believed that. In fact, in regional spaces, India has always said that we are interconnected, we are interdependent. But I think this is now being viewed at a global level also. COVID and probably the fallout of that, the Russia-Ukraine war, I think somewhere this is getting more and more foregrounded. And this would definitely feed into making the exchange of ideas more meaningful at this conference. What do you think are some barriers that might, crop up?
Well, one of the most important issues that is there, which is not formally on the agenda, is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. There are views around it and very strong views on completely blocking supplies from Russia so that they can be squeezed out. But, at the same time, there is another view, which India is on that side, that economic interests need to be kept in mind and everyone should have the space to pursue autonomous policies. So that is something that is going to come about. The other thing is the impact, as we had discussed, of, rate actions or policy actions that take place in one country, especially when it comes to the developed world, and the impact that it has on the developing and the poor economies. That is an issue where there needs to be some consensus, because the developed countries need to bear in mind that actions will not be limited to their borders, but will have a ripple effect elsewhere.
What do you think is the role of or the positioning of cryptocurrency in future financial arrangements? Because the coming in of the digital rupee is somewhere a recognition that yes, digital transactions along with digital rupees or digital currencies is the way to move forward. But how do you think this is going to pan out for cryptocurrencies?
Well, the digital rupee that you referred to, which is currently in the trial phase, it's not been rolled out full-fledged, is a valid digital currency that will be issued by the central bank, whereas cryptocurrencies or crypto assets are issued by private entities. So that's the big difference. And the whole attempt is to regulate those crypto assets. So how you regulate them is a big area of concern, given that regulations in one part of the world cannot deal with that. Even if one country decides to evolve its regulations, they cannot stop it completely.
Right.
So the idea is to build a consensus around regulating crypto assets. But the challenge is, how do governments, how do central banks coordinate, how do regulators coordinate to ensure that the regulations are foolproof and people don't circumvent those regulations. It requires a high level of political consensus, and it is not going to happen overnight, especially given that it has challenges for the banking system, for the financial system, and the overall economy.
Absolutely. In fact, consensus building has barriers and boundaries, and crypto does not understand barriers and boundaries. And you're right, absolutely. That's going to be a tough one. Siddharth, thank you so much for joining in. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on G20 Finance Track priorities under India's presidency at G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting. The participants were Siddharth, Economic Analyst, and Gaura Dhawan Lal, AIR Correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsgtalks@gmail.com.